Hello and welcome to Newsmakers on CHCH Podcast. I'm your host, Louie Butko, and today I'm very pleased to be joined by Don Jonescu. You may have heard of him on CHCH Morning Live as Producer Don. He's now working on different projects here at CHCH, including our 70th anniversary, which is coming up on
June the 7th, Louie.
June the 7th, 2024, this year. Okay, good to know, because we've been planning this for a while. But Don, thanks so much for doing this. What is it that you do around here? We said special projects. We said 70th. What do you do here, Don?
Well, I do features. For example, you and I teamed up on the Bulldogs feature the last couple of years, which have gone really well. I should say Bulldogs Foundation. And then I try to generate content that we may not otherwise have in the confines of our regular news broadcasts.
The Remembrance Day show, you play a pretty big role in that as well, don't you?
That's true, Louie, but with the 70th anniversary, I'm keeping it in the back of my mind.
It's coming up, though, November 11th,
until July. Is it November 11th again this year?
This year. We'll get into some of the 70th anniversary stuff in a bit, but you got a pretty big get. And, you know, on top of what you do here, when you're watching the evening news and you see an interview with big-time celebrities, you're usually the man behind a lot of those.
Yeah, it was something I decided to try a few months ago. I think I've now done 23 of them, but the first one was Nancy Wilson from Heart, and they were facilitated by a colleague of mine, and it's worked out really, really, really well.
And one of them, one of the big gets, you were pretty proud about this one. You basically told everyone in the newsroom, basically the second you got it confirmed, Burton Cummings, you had a chance to sit down with him. That's pretty cool. I
did it, and I don't think I did it just once. I think I told everybody repeatedly, and anyone knew who walked in. I was like, oh, hey, Adam. It was pretty exciting. I mean, I grew up listening to the guy.
How did it come about?
Well, in the course of my research into the 70th anniversary, I've been looking at some old CHCH content, and I came across the music show In Session, which aired beginning in the early 80s. And I came across Burton doing a bit with Don Everly of the Everly Brothers. And I thought, well, wouldn't that be fun to get Burton Cummings on to talk about that? So I dug out who his press folks were, sent them an email along with the clip, and people were smiling, and it got done.
Pretty quick turnaround, too, right? One of those surprising things that when you send an email out and you think you're not going to hear anything for weeks.
Yeah, I sent it out in the morning. By the afternoon, I had a tentative confirmation, and then the next day we were good to go.
So we talked about In Session. That was a show that ran here in the 80s, paired two musical artists from different genres. He was paired with
Don Everly of the Everly Brothers.
And he admitted that he was actually pretty nervous about it.
I mean, this is Burton Cummings of the Guess Who.
This is what he had to say about being on In Session here on CHCH.
I remember waking up that morning in the hotel in Toronto before we drove there. And I was nervous as hell because I was going to be doing the harmony parts on some of the songs I had grown up with as a kid. And I remember that morning being in the shower and singing the high harmony parts to songs I thought we were going to do. It's a very vivid memory to me.
Now, that's pretty cool when you think about even Burton Cummings at the time. You know, we're talking about the 80s, the Guess Who's been around for a while. This is like, you wouldn't think of him as somebody who would be nervous about performing anywhere, let alone a small studio show at the time.
Absolutely. I mean, there wasn't a K-Tel album in the late 70s, early 80s that didn't have a Burton Cummings song on it. And yeah, here he is saying, oh, I'm really nervous. I get the high notes part. But.
Yeah. Now, Burton Cummings, obviously, the Guess Who, huge part. You were obviously a big Burton Cummings fan, big Guess Who fan.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, when he talks about music and memories, I mean, I remember driving in our station wagon and listening to Burton on the AM radio. And between Burton and the Guess Who, it was constant, and it was beyond Canadian content. It was because they were good.
And like we said, they really hit their stride in the early mid-70s, and Burton had a bit of an issue adjusting with fame.
Well, yeah, he sure did. I mean, it came, the Guess Who were popular in the late 60s. And when he joined in 1969, they had already got some street cred and were being listened to. And yeah, here he is joining a successful group.
Here's what he had to say about joining the band here in the 70s.
It was all a little bit surreal, you know. I was a little kid from the north end of Winnipeg, and before I knew it, I was on American Bandstand getting a gold record from Dick Clark. That's a huge leap in your reality when you're still only 20 or 21. You know, I was quite young when all of that happened, and they're very vivid memories. I'll tell you something about the gold records, Don. The years may come and go, but they're still just as beautiful today as they always were.
That's pretty awesome. And 20, 21, like I'm thinking what I was doing at 20. I was not going on American Bandstand and picking up gold records from Dick Clark.
And at that age, he's actually been in the group for 3 years.
Wow.
So he's almost like a seasoned vet. I think in rock and roll years, 3 years is like, 50.
Yeah. We talked about, obviously, some of his hit songs. We're going to get into a bit more specifics on hit songs, but having a hit record, something the Guess Who obviously did. He was a part of that. Let's hear what he had to say about the importance of having a hit record. Here's what Burton Cummings had to say to Don.
One of the interesting things is when you have a hit record, the trickle-down effect is almost immeasurable. You can't imagine. I mean, nowadays with social media, I'm talking to people in New Zealand and Australia and even behind the Iron Curtain in certain areas. And that's all because of hit records. You know, the trickle-down effect of hit records is almost infinite because hit records are like signposts in people's lives. Don, I can remember when I hear certain records, I can remember how I was dressing, where I was living, who I was dating, what my hair looked like, what if I was driving a car, what car it was. Hit records can take you back to all of that. And I've never taken it lightly that I've been lucky enough to have hit records. That was a dream when I was a little kid. That was a big dream.
Couple things out of that, Don. One, the vivid memories of music. We've heard studies after studies after studies. We've seen the stories of dementia patients, Alzheimer's patients who can be triggered by certain songs. Music really is such a powerful thing, and you felt it with Burton Cummings. This wasn't something he took for granted at all.
No, absolutely not. And it just shows, like, one of my takeaways was how he is still appreciative of the fans, and he gets the fans' reaction, because as we're going to hear in the next clip, there was a group and some music that he still gets impacted by. They were a big group in the 60s. Care to guess who they were?
Rolling Stones.
Rhymes with Schmeedles.
Rolling Stones.
Yes.
Okay, the Beatles. Yes. Oh, so this is so we're saying that this is the music that he was listening to growing
That's right.
up. So this is what he had to say about that.
I was in Toronto. We were in our old highway bus, and we were driving down one of the main streets of downtown, Yonge Street, or some very, very busy street. We had the radio on, and it was the first time we had ever heard Hey Jude by the Beatles. And we're driving along, and the record's going on, and we're driving along, and the record's going on, and we had never heard anything like that on AM radio. It was about 7 minutes. But you see, that's what I mean about records being signposts. I'll never forget that memory of that particular record, and it happened to be Hey Jude by the Beatles.
Classic, right? I mean, just what we said before, like that one song. So for me, like, obviously I'm a few years younger than you, Don. Like, my thing is like really like obviously I grew up high school. It was the pop electro kind of sound. So there are songs that I can hear now where like this is gonna sound really stupid, but like Dynamite by Tayo Cruz. I can go back to like my grade 12 graduation party, after party type thing, that song coming on. Like what he says, like you can picture everything so clearly. And again, you just know how serious he takes this when it's not even his own music, it's other music. This is just a music fan.
Yeah, and you know, for me, any Rush song takes me right back to going to concerts with the lads and some of the shenanigans we may or may not have gotten into. Yeah, it's, you know, music and smells. They are the things that really, really trigger our memories.
There's this very specific type of gum where I can remember like my first kiss having a very specific, like girl having a very specific gum, and it's still very popular. It's not mint, but it's still a very popular flavor. And it's like every time it's just like an emotional trigger back to there, right? Like it's music and smells.
I'm kind of reacting. Did you say you kissed a girl?
Once. I did once.
And did you like it?
Okay,
See,
easy,
that's another song.
Easy, Katy Perry. So the Guess Who, we all know how incredible they like. It's just an incredible Canadian band. People might be shocked to learn, especially when you see recent names of people going into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The Guess Who are not in the Rock and Roll. I believe some of them are in
They're in Songwriting Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
Canadian Hall of Fame.
BTO in Randy Bogman. He was like, no, nothing.
None of them are in Cleveland's Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Have you ever been?
No, I came close though.
Yeah?
I was in Cleveland.
Okay.
Once. Instead, I opted to go see the house where Jerry Siegel lived, the co-creator of Superman. So you know.
And we'll get to your love of comic books in just a second. But if you're upset about the Guess Who not being in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, you would think Burton Cummings would be too. You actually asked him about it. Here was his response about not being in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
I don't lose any sleep over it. I really don't, because it's not what it started out as. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, it's not just rock and roll anymore. It's all kinds of other stuff. And I don't know if it's really properly named, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Maybe there should be a different name, title for it. But let's not even go there. I don't lose any sleep about it. You know, I am lucky enough in the current age of social media, I'm lucky enough to have people talking to me all over the world, from all over the world. And I'm not going to let a building in Cleveland undo all that for me.
I mean, it is a nice building. It's right on the waterfront. I mean, the waterfront of Lake Erie, but it's still right on the waterfront. And really even keeled about it. Obviously doesn't lose any sleep. You mentioned that a couple times.
Well, that's amazing. I did promise him that I'll carry the rage for him, and he seemed to be okay with that. But yeah, it's amazing to me. Is it quintessentially Canadian that we're like, it'd be nice, but you know, I'm not going to dwell on it.
Now, we obviously know, we've talked about this already. For me, These Eyes was a song. Again, I go back to high school. Really got this second life, especially among people my age. Michael Cera's character basically threatened Jimmy's brother with the beautiful singing voice from Arizona. These Eyes was the song that he chose, and let's hear Burton Cummings, him talking about These Eyes. That obviously
and the song. The riff's important.
Here we go.
Everybody thinks because I'm the piano player, everybody thinks that I came up with that piano riff, but that was actually Randy Bachman that came up with that piano riff, and he showed it to me one day when we were writing the song. And I thought to myself, without saying it out loud, I thought to myself, man, that's pretty cool for a guitar player to come up with that. It was just that, you know, Randy used to mess around on piano a little bit, and he took violin before he ever played guitar. So he was a real musician's musician, and he came up with that little guitar, that little piano riff at the beginning. Of course, we modified the song a whole lot after that, but I thought that was kind of interesting. And it was magical time to come from the north end of Winnipeg and all of a sudden feel that magic that our single was climbing up the charts in the top 100 in Billboard. That was a dream.
Yeah, rising the charts again. He talks about his humble beginnings in this band, just a kid from Winnipeg. Like, couldn't imagine the feeling of just watching climbing up the charts. And he talked about writing with Randy Bachman again, like one of the quintessential Canadian songwriters of a generation and then some.
And already at that time, I mean, Randy wasn't done by any means. He had, he was still producing and creating these things. And Burton again comes in. He's the youngin', and he's right in there, and he's saying, that's a great riff. We can do this and we can do that. The minutia on how this music is created is always fascinating.
And even like this is before your Adobe Premiere editing where you have all your riffs and everything. It's literally just sitting there playing. Okay, you play, then I come in. Like it obviously a different generation, but still it was different technology to be able to create sounds like this.
Well, I imagine that they took the tape, listened to it, took the razor blade, cut out the parts they needed, and glued them back together. That's something us more veteran members of this industry.
Yeah, with film, right? Yes. With film, we don't tape on film anymore. By the way, just so you don't know. Now, Burton talked about being the piano player, but he also mastered a couple of other instruments. Here's what he had to say about that.
When we were really getting going, and we were doing weekly television for CBC. We did weekly television for 2 years, about 80 shows in 2 years, and during that time, we had to cover all the songs that were on the hit parade that week. So we would be doing songs that, by guitar bands that didn't have any piano. We would be doing songs maybe by Traffic and Jethro Tull, songs that had flute in them. And the guys in the band used to think of me as maybe I could be a kind of a utility guy. I could play a little bit of flute here. I could play a little bit of harmonica here. I could switch to guitar on certain songs because you don't need keyboards, but you need an extra guitar. So Randy kind of shoved me in those directions. He helped me learn how to play just enough guitar to be annoying. So I'm not really a great guitar player, but I can play enough to play rhythm on stage. And then I learned the flute because no one had ever bothered to tell me that the fingering was the same as the sax. And I had played sax for years in the Devrons, but I had never picked up a flute. So once I could get the aperture correct to get the notes out of the like that, the fingering was identical as the sax, so I was halfway home already. I just always kept one in my pocket for an entire summer. That was when I was still in the Devrons, and I was trying to learn how to play like Paul Jones from Manfred Mann, and maybe a little bit of what Brian Jones and Mick Jagger were doing on harmonica. I was always fascinated by these really great harp players,
Harp players. You never think of him playing anything other than keyboards, though, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely not. And to find out that it was Randy Bachman who drove him to learn these other instruments. I had a conversation with a colleague. He said, I don't think he ever played guitar. And I said, no. So I wanted to make sure I had that on the record.
Yeah. He mentioned the Devrons a couple times. What was that?
So they were a group in the 60s that he joined, and he would sing for them, and they toured local towns in Canada, and they did all right. And in fact, that's where Randy Bachman and the Guess Who actually first heard him for the first time. And again, he was only like 15, 16 because he's 17 when he joins Guess Who.
So that's so Burton, he talked about this in your interview. He mentioned joining the band in his early 20s, but his time with the Guess Who starting much earlier. Here's what he had to say about that.
I was 17, and the other guys were all in their 20s, and Cale had already been married for a couple of years. So, yeah, I was considerably younger in stature, because there's a heck of a difference between 17 and 22, but there's no difference between 45 and 50. You know what I mean? There's there's a huge difference in those growing years younger.
Yeah, you talked about it there. You're 17. I mentioned being 21 and not having a clue what I was going to do with the rest of my life. 17, it was even more of a question mark. Here he is joining already established band, but the Guess Who at the time.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think I just gotten my driver's license. I was trying to figure out how I was going to pass grade 11 math. You know, a lot of pressure when you're 17.
After These Eyes came what became an unintentional protest song.
Right. And in fact, it was his young age that was really the stimulus that created American Woman.
And here's what Burton Cummings had to say about that.
We were doing 2 shows that night. We had been touring the States on the strength of These Eyes and Laughing and Undone. You know, we had some records on the radio, so we had been touring the States. When we came back to Canada, I noticed that the girls weren't trying. It didn't seem that they were trying as hard to grow up as fast. And in the States, it seemed the girls were wearing more makeup earlier, younger. They were just faster. It just seemed like that to me. And now maybe that's just because I was a little hick from the north end of Winnipeg. I hadn't seen the world very much. But anyway, so we came back to Canada, and we were doing that second show, and the guys went up and started the second show. I was outside bargaining for some old Gene Vincent records that this kid had, and I wanted to barter. I wanted to get those records. The guys knew it was time for the second show. They ran in, they started playing. Bachman came up with this riff, and they just started playing. And I'm still outside with this guy bartering for Gene Vincent records. And I hear this. I said, "Oh God, man! I'm supposed to be on stage. I got to get out of here. I'm supposed to be on stage." So I run inside. I run up on stage, and these guys are already jamming. So I just started singing whatever came into my head. And at first, I was just trying to make things rhyme. Colored lights can hypnotize, sparkle someone else's eyes. But then I remembered something. I looked out at the girls. And what I was thinking in the comparison of not growing up as fast and looking maybe a little more down to earth, what I was thinking was, Canadian woman, I prefer you. But what came out of my mouth was, American woman, stay away from me. It was never meant to be political, but it happened in 1970 when the Vietnam War was at its worst point of escalation. It was on everybody's conversations those days. And so political inferences were read into the song. But I never meant it politically. It was just timing. It was the time of history in the world. And there were, I believe at that point, there were thousands and thousands of American soldiers over there. And they loved the song because it kind of, it stood up and said something. It's a bit of a Cinderella story, Don. And when the vice president of RCA flew from New York to hear the new album, because we had been recording in RCA studios in Chicago. So he flew from New York to Chicago to hear the new album, hopefully, something new from the Guess Who. And when we started playing American Woman, and when the cut American Woman was halfway through, he had a newspaper with him. He threw the newspaper up in the air and he said, "Oh my gosh, that's a #1 record." And it came to be. It happened to be. Great story, and I swear that's all true.
Pretty awesome. Pretty awesome story there.
What an amazing story. And he's like 20, right? So they do American Woman. Bachman's probably in his middle 20s. Burton is, 20.
Yeah.
And they write an anthem. They write an anthem. I just wanted to share that Gene Vincent, for those who aren't in the know, was a crooner back in the 50s. His biggest hit was Bebop Alua, She's My Baby. Bebopaloo, I don't.
Well, wait, we don't have the rights for these songs,
Oh, that's
Don.
true.
We don't have the rights.
It's under 30 seconds.
They're gonna pull the podcast if we don't sign off on the rights. The Guess Who, as were many artists in their time, TV was getting more popular. More people obviously had it in their homes, and the Guess Who did a lot of TV, and not just the CBC.
Well, it's crazy. They appear on The Dating Game, and they sing, but it gets crazier because one of them becomes Bachelor number 3.
Here's Burton Cummings on the Guess Who being on The Dating Game.
Here's the thing, Don. There was no MTV yet. There was no rock and roll. There was no pop music on television, really, to speak of. Other than, if you were lucky, on a Sunday night, there might be 1 or 2 singers on the Ed Sullivan Show, but that was about it. So when they offered to let us do a lip sync of Undone on The Dating Game, if I would be one of the contestants, I mean, the other 3 guys were all married. By that time, the other 3 guys were all married. I was the single guy, so I had to be the bachelor, but it was a chance for us to have national American television exposure if I would agree to be Bachelor number 3. So I did, and we got the exposure. And fortunately, I wasn't picked because I didn't want to go halfway around the world on some date when we were supposed to be touring.
So he gets on the show, Bachelor number 3, and he wasn't. By the way, he wasn't the first or only celebrity to appear on the show.
No, I mean, if you go back and look, Tom Selleck famously appeared, Magnum PI, no mustache,
Ooh.
and Farrah Fawcett
Was on the dating.
She was not on the panel. She was the person doing the interviewing.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That show probably wouldn't fly today. I guess Love is Blind.
did.
It's the same thing, right?
Yeah.
Is it not the same
And
thing as Love is Blind?
It did come back in a new incarnation, but it certainly didn't have the. It reflects our current times, perhaps, not the 60s, 70s sensibility.
So during the interview, Burton started talking about new music. Mm-hmm. Here's what he had to say about that.
I've just finished a brand new album, and I'm very, very happy with it. I think I'm old and mature enough now to realize whether it's good or bad, and I really believe it's quite good. I'm very proud of the lyrics. There's a song called Arrogance, which I think is one of the strongest things I've ever written lyrically. And there's another song about the death of John Lennon and John Bonham and Jim Morrison. There's another song called, there's one, the Arrogance for sure, I think is very, very strong. There's another song called Speak to Me, which is a classic ballad. It sounds like that old Stand Tall guy that used to be on the radio years and years ago. So I'm very happy with this album. I think the lyrics are the strongest that I've ever had. And I think that only comes with living X number of years. You know, I'm 76 now. The next birthday I'll be 77, and I'm a little too ancient now to put out lyrics that would embarrass me in 3 or 4 years. So I'm very careful about the lyrics, and I think they're very strong.
He mentioned being 76 there. He looks great for 76, by the way.
Absolutely.
I don't think he's using any product in that. You know, he's not coloring it up. He looks like he's...
And I don't think he's got a ring light there.
Yeah, guy looks great for 76. When's the new album coming out? Did he mention that?
Well, it's coming out soon.
Okay.
No specific release date. He's hoping, I think, to get it out. He tours the U.S. in July and plays Casino Rama on July 1st. So somewhere around there.
Okay.
But, I mean...
If you've been watching this podcast, whether on YouTube or on our website, you might have noticed that in the clips of Burton Cummings, great backdrop. There's a Bob Dylan book, I think, over his shoulder. You mentioned The Far Side, but what's been impossible to miss is the giant poster of The Doors and Jim Morrison. And there's a legend particularly going around that they actually hung out together.
It is a crazy story, and again, just an example of how life lines up circumstance.
Here's Burton Cummings talking about hanging out with Jim Morrison of the Doors.
It's important to know that the very first night I ever touched my foot on California soil, that was what happened. I had never been to California before. We had flown down. I believe we had flown down to do American Bandstand. And we get there about 8:30 or 9 o'clock at night. The other three guys are old. And to me, you're in LA for the first time. Why would you stay in your hotel room? I went out and walked for miles. I walked all down Sunset to see Dino's, where they used to film 77 Sunset Strip. I kept walking. I got to the Whiskey, and I wanted to see the Whiskey for years when everybody used to play there. So by this time, it's about 1 o'clock in the morning. I go inside, spend a few minutes in the Whiskey, drink in the vibes, and I say to myself, okay, I'm okay now to go back to the hotel. I've seen the Whiskey, I've seen Dino's, I've seen Sunset Strip. Okay. I walk out of the Whiskey. There's a ton of cabs outside. I hail a cab to go back to my hotel. Before I say a word, the cab driver says, "So, are you going to the big party too?" Well, I'm no fool. I said, "Yeah, let's go, let's go." So next thing I know, I've been in California a total of maybe 3 hours in my life. And I'm on my way to some huge party up in the hills above Sunset Strip to some mansion that looks like the Beverly Hillbillies. So we get to this place, and I say to the cab driver, "Look, I'm just, leading you on here. I wasn't invited here. I don't know what this is, but can you please wait here? I don't know where to get, how to get back to where I'm supposed to be. Wait here and see if I get in. If I don't get in, then please take me home." So he waited. I knocked the door. Sure enough, I got in, and it was a wild, crazy place. People swimming naked in the pool and drinking and screaming and yelling and loud music, and people everywhere. So I found a little piano over in the corner, and I was sitting playing a couple of licks on the piano. Some guy sits next to me on the piano stool and starts playing a couple of notes up high. And I didn't look at first, but after a couple of minutes, I turned, and it was Jim Morrison sitting next to me on the piano stool playing a little piano. So I said to him, first thing that came into my head, I said, "Hey, man, follow me. I know where there's some cold beers," because I knew he liked beer. So we went in the kitchen, had a beer, and he was already a little bit drunk, and he was going to drive. So I said, no, man, give me the keys. Let me drive. And he was with two girls. So Jim and the two girls got in the back seat, and I had the keys to his GTO, and I ended up driving him around LA that night for a good 2 hours, maybe even more, talking about everything. I never told him I was a musician. I never wanted to get in his face. I just wanted to hear him talk. And he talked about existentialism. He talked about the universe. He talked about the Renaissance painters all ending up in France. He was a very well-read guy. He really was. I think the biggest area of weakness that Jim Morrison had was self-preservation. You know, he didn't look after himself, but he certainly was a bright guy. He was no dummy.
That story in itself is a movie, right? I mean, here's this kid from Winnipeg, Manitoba, who has a couple of big hits, who gets to LA and then is driving around Jim Morrison all night. Like, that story is unbelievable.
And then takes the influence, writes a series of hit records, and then a couple of years later, when Jim Morrison dies, the movie ends with him on his knees sobbing over Jim Morrison's grave in France.
You talk, obviously, the guy lived an exciting life. You talked to him about one of the quotes he lived by in his younger days.
Yeah, I got to credit OGs at, I think that's what the kids say,
yep,
at Much Music, Jeannie Becker and J.D. Roberts, who asked him, you know, are you going to grow up? Are you grown up?
Here's what he had to say about that.
I still like baseball cards. I still like comic books. I still have all my Warner Brothers cartoons on DVD. I don't think I have. I certainly don't want to. I want to keep that childhood interest alive for a long time yet.
He clearly lives with that childhood-like interest too.
Yeah.
The comic book things. Did you know that about him? Because you're this cat's out of the bag. You are a big comic book guy
Hardcore.
yourself. Yeah.
Listen, I was shocked. I did notice the Superman toy or whatever he had in the back, but he's the second person of stature that I've interviewed who said they were a comic book fan, and we didn't even have that in common. Paul Anka, of all people, has, as he says, boxes and boxes and boxes of comics stored away, and he's got it very precisely laid out in his will what to do with them.
Burton Cummings, great interview, man.
Oh, thanks.
Glad we could showcase some of that a little bit more in depth. That was a lot of fun. You also talked to somebody recently, back to the 70th anniversary. What you've been tasked to do as part of this, we mentioned this, is tracking down these people who had a connection, who played on CHCH, like Burton Cummings did, who maybe grew up watching CHCH. And that's what we find in one of your other guests recently. You talked to local boy Dave Thomas of SCTV fame for the 70th anniversary. Now, how did that come about?
Well, again, I noticed that we had his contacts because he had appeared on Morning Live. So I like to take big swings. And I thought, well, the guy was born in St. Catharines, moved away, came back, settled in Dundas. He might be a good one. So I called him up, left a message on his machine. So this is me talking to one of the McKenzie brothers on his machine. And again, within a couple hours, he calls me back and we have a discussion. And he said, yeah, he's in. And wow. It still has an impact on him.
It's crazy how quickly he brought up some CHCH institutions during your chat. Here's what he had to say about his memories of this station. Here's Dave Thomas.
The main memory I have, and this was probably my favorite part of CHCH, was family theater. We used to have TV trays in our family room where the TV was. And we would watch family theater while we're having dinner. And, you know, it was a real 60s thing to do, I think. But CHCH had all the old classic movies that they played in family theater. And my dad had seen most of them. And so I got an education in the classics and the great actors who had gone before. And in no small way, that was due to family theater.
It's pretty interesting. He brings up his dad watching classic movies on CHCH. We were at a family party on Sunday. You know, my grandma has CHCH on, and it's a classic movie. You know, and he's, oh, what actor is that? Let's start from the beginning. I want to see what actor. I'm like, Dad, it's in info. Just hit the info button. But CHCH has always had that retro feel, that classic feel to it. And Dave Thomas, even as a child, can relate to that. And family theater, what a throwback.
Yeah, I mean, you know, at that time, it wasn't considered retro. It was considered current and hip and happening. Mm-hmm. And, it's like a precursor of what we have evolved to.
And it wasn't just family theater. Mr. Dave Thomas watched all of our programming here on CHCH.
Remember Billy Van's and House of Frightenstein, too. But Billy Van was a real multi-talented guy. I mean, he could do a lot of stuff.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
And who didn't love Frankenstein?
Well, of course. I mean, it was on Saturday morning or Sunday morning. It was edgy because it was scary. And it had rock music when the Igor, I think it was, would dance into the psychedelic window. I mean, that was pretty hip if you're 10 years old.
It had Vincent Price.
And it had Vincent Price, who'd come in and shoot his stuff in like a day or two.
Like, all his scenes were shot. Somebody else told me that. Like, all his scenes were shot in a weekend. Like, because he's in every episode. Like, he's in, obviously, every episode. He's the host, is he not? Right? Yep. Like, so, all that done in one weekend, one afternoon. He also talked about local TV, and this is something I've even talked to my guests, here on this show about local TV, the importance of local TV, especially today.
Yeah, it was really important for him, but he tells us one of his biggest regrets, and it's one that I think had everyone here when I shared it slapping their foreheads at a missed opportunity.
Here's what he had to say. Here's what Don's referring to.
Local TV was kind of all the same all over North America, and Canada was no different than the United States in that respect. So, but I do think that CHCH was a bigger broadcaster than some of the others. The stations in Buffalo had the American networks behind them because they were owned and operated affiliates, but CHCH was its own little private engine that chugged along for many years, and rivaled. I thought it offered better programming than CBC, absolutely, for sure. Really, and CTV too, for that matter. And then Global came along and it tried to do some other stuff, variety stuff that CHCH didn't do. I mean, I know if CHCH had done a variety show, Marty Short would have tried to get on it. I would have tried to get on it, but they didn't. And I'd always look at it and think, man, that's the life. Having a career in television, that would be great, It was just a dream for me at that time.
Now, could you imagine young Dave Thomas, Marty Short, Eugene Levy? I mean, these are guys who were performing in Burlington, right? McMaster, theater programs. Somebody had opened the door and been like, hey, you want to come do something here in your own backyard? You don't have to go too far. Like, could you imagine that?
I can't. It's amazing. The station has so much history baked into it anyway, whether it's Steve Smith and Red Green. But imagine Marty Short, Dave Thomas, Eugene, even Ivan Reitman.
Yeah. Those good
amazing.
McMaster boys.
Yep.
Before we go, we talked about the institutions of CH. Sometimes that's TV shows. Sometimes that's people. You know a lot about this, trying to track down some of those people. But Dave also talked about the late Bill Lawrence, and here's what he had to say about that.
And I never met Billy Van. Isn't that weird? My whole career, I never met him. And,
wow.
Bill Lawrence, of course, I met because he lived down the street. And he was a very nice gentleman. He was like Mr. Rogers. He really was. He was like that kind of person.
Like I said, an institution. Anybody you've ever talked to about Bill Lawrence, it's the same thing.
I had the opportunity to meet him. I had an opportunity to meet him when we rebooted Tiny Talent Time. And what a gentleman. Just an absolute gentleman.
The 70th is coming up on June 7th.
Correct.
You're going to have much more about, that's what you're doing. You're working hard on things like this. I know you came from a meeting about that very topic just minutes before the show.
It's a lot. And the programming is going to start well before June 7th.
Cool.
And it'll be on all our different platforms. And without giving too much away, we're going to have special segments with Alex Reynolds and even a little reunion with a couple anchors. I won't give their names away, but one of their names starts with a C.
Connie.
And the other starts with a D.
Don. Dave. Derek.
Dan.
Oh, Dan. Oh, okay. All right. I was just going to keep going D names until you stop me. Don, that's a D name. Really appreciate you making the time and doing this, putting together those clips. Very informative. Burton Cummings, what a great get. Dave Thomas, what a great get. Keep working hard to get people like that.
I have no choice.
My thanks to Don Jonescu for joining me today. And my thanks to you for joining us, because we could not do the show without your support. Make sure you like and subscribe to CHCH Podcast so you never miss an episode of this show or any of the other great shows we have for you, including Sportsline with Bubba O'Neill, whose guest yesterday I heard was the best ever. I don't know who it was, but you should go check it out.